Some of you we haven't seen some of you for a long time. Carrie and I, we came back from a mini sabbatical, and we've been back for a couple of weeks now. It feels like a lifetime already, but it wasn't, and it's lovely to be back, and it's a privilege to be worshipping and being barbecuing and being part of this fantastic church family. We have many memories of our time in France. All sorts of amazing memories, actually. But one of them, actually, for me particularly, was driving back from the south of France and making our way up back home, up through France. And we were on one of their motorways, and as we were going north, we suddenly saw these convoys of emergency services heading south. I mean, just columns of them. The police, the fire brigade, the army, they were just coming down. And as we were heading north, they were heading towards the southwest of France and towards the wildfires that were raging there, that we now know are raging all across Europe. And watching the news, now we've come back, we've seen the impact and the devastation that those wildfires, that those storms have caused to so many. And we're in a series now, a mini-series within the Gospel of Mark. If you want to know where to go in your Bible, it is Mark's Gospel. It's always Mark's Gospel at the moment. But we're talking about how to have faith in the storms of life. And what we talked about, I talked about last week, is that there's no such thing as a storm-free life. But we can have what I want to call a storm-free heart. So how do we have peace in the middle of the storms of life? Well, Jesus is the master storyteller. And at the end of his very first message, the Sermon on the Mount, he tells a very, very simple story, actually. There were two men who built two houses. One of them built their house on rock, the other built his house on sand, and then the storm came. And the one that built his house on the rock stood firm, and the one that built his house on the sand fell flat. Well done. It's participatory. Well done. We've all sang that chorus. And then he says this: anyone who hears these words of mine and put them into practice is like the man who built his house on the rock. And anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice, they're the ones that built their life on sand. And that's it. That's the story. He puts the mic down and walks away and heads off for home. And Jesus tells that story, and you left the people that heard that story pondering what I believe are three eternal truths that they had to think about before they went home for lunch that day. Okay, the first is that everybody builds a house. And I'm not talking about a physical house. I'm talking about the house of our life. Everybody builds a house by the decisions that they make. You see, our lives are the sum of all the decisions that we make, and we are responsible. We're stewards of the houses that we build. The second eternal truth is this: that everyone faces a storm. I'm going to be saying this for the month. There's no such thing as a storm-free life. You know, we face storms of life through trials and challenges and adversity. There is no way you can build your house, you can build your life where you will not face a storm. I think I've noticed this quite a lot in magazines and on the news and advertisements, etc., that in our culture, we seem to fantasize about retirement. That retirement is a place where you have a storm-free life. I have to say, we've got quite a few retirees here. And I know you and I love you all, and it's extraordinary because when I sit down and have a coffee with you or a pint with you or something like that, I've noticed that you all have storms. We have storms. We all have, even retirees have storms in life. And one day, just call me a prophet, we will face the ultimate storm, which is sickness leading unto death. And many of us have had loved ones that have been on that journey. Which leads us to the final eternal truth that Jesus is teaching here, is that the storms test the foundations. That when we experience storms in life, it's foundations of our lives. And it asks us this question: what have we been building our lives upon? And Jesus said that the foolish person was the person who built his life on sand. I'm thinking about that. I've been thinking about it a lot. I know I'm paid to think about it and pray about it, but I do. And I think about these things anyway. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I think I'm going to build my life on sand. But what happens is we get overwhelmed by life, don't we? We get busy in life. We end up building things that do not hold. But we build on things like wealth or health or achievement or fame or success or relationships, and the storms test the foundations of what we're building on. A little while ago, I came across a story about a woman called Madison. She was 27. And when she was born, the doctor said that she would end up in adulthood with one leg about a foot shorter than the other leg. And so a number of the doctors suggested to her parents that they amputate her leg. And there was one other doctor who said, I'm going to take on her case. I'm going to try and care for her and help her. And she had, by the time I'd read this account, 32 surgeries on her leg throughout her lifetime to lengthen it, to strengthen it, to reconstruct it. And it was extremely painful for her, and I think for her parents, who loved her. And in order to lengthen it, this is where I want to get into the detail, the doctors would break her femur in half, and they would insert screws that they would turn every couple of weeks. Millimetre by millimetre, they would pull the bones apart and force the leg, I didn't really understand the medics of this, but they would force the leg to regrow a new bone, and slowly it lengthened over time. As I listened to her story, she was asked this question, what have you learned through all of this? What do you know that we need to know? And here's what she said. I wrote it down. It was so profound. Never put my identity in anything that could be taken from me in a day. Never put my identity in anything that can be taken from me in a day. I've been thinking about that. How anything can be taken from us in a day: a job, family, parent, spouse, friendship, relationship, bank accounts, health. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to the conclusion that the only thing that cannot be taken from us in a day is Jesus. So what Jesus is teaching us is build your life on me. Let me be the foundation of your life so that when the storms come, the foundation will hold, because storms will come and storms have a way of testing the foundations. And Mark, just to remind us, is writing this gospel of the church in Rome that is experiencing a storm. They are experiencing persecution. Nero is on the throne. He's persecuting the Christians. He's killing the Christians. He's putting them in prison. He's putting them on crosses. He's throwing them in the Colosseum to fend for themselves against wild sort of animals, beasts and lions. If you ever have time, read the first 42 pages of Fox's Book of Martyrs. Anyone ever read it? Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? It's incredible, okay? It tells the historical account of the persecution that was experienced in Rome at this time. And Mark is writing this eyewitness account of what happened, and it is traumatic. The suffering that the church experienced is truly traumatic. This is a gospel account of the suffering of Jesus written to other people who are experiencing trauma. And I realise the word trauma gets used a lot in our culture. I think it gets misused in our culture. It gets chucked around in our culture. People say things like, I went to Starbucks the other day and they mixed my order up. It was traumatic. Or I was in M&S the other day and I saw my mother-in-law. It was traumatic. It may be true, Dick said, but that's not trauma. That's a trial. That's everyday life. But what happens when we take a word like trauma and overuse it and we can end up minimizing the suffering of people who have experienced or are experiencing real trauma in life. So let me give you a definition of trauma. I'm not sure I put this on, I'm so sorry, but trauma is an event. Oh, that's good, thank you. Trauma is an event or a series of events that leaves you feeling powerless and produces lasting effects that overwhelm your ability to function normally. Yet, we can minimize the suffering of people that experience real trauma, like the people in Gaza, the people on the front line of, wars, people whose homes have been destroyed by wildfires in Spain, France, in Greece. Someone like Tom, who's been through extraordinary trauma as a result of his fall. The widow of P.C. Harper. People have suffered abuse, violence, and disease. And today, Mark has given us these accounts that we're going to look at so that we can see how Jesus responds to trauma. We're going to see the grace and the mercy and the compassion of Jesus. Because Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Jesus is, I love saying this, Jesus is perfect theology. And what we see in Jesus is the tenderness of Jesus. And Mark is giving us these stories for a church that is dealing with trauma here. And for the church of today, where around the world people deal with trauma. In local churches, individually, people are carrying trauma. We see the theology of how God responds to our suffering. And what we see is, and what we've been reminded of in communion, is that Jesus suffers with us. Jesus enters into the suffering of humanity. Compassion means to suffer with. So he suffers with us. And ultimately, as we've been reminded in communion, that he suffers for us. That he took our trauma upon himself on the cross. So here's a God who comes to us with tenderness and compassion in our suffering. We are in Mark chapter 5 today. While we're not going to regale you with stories about everything we did on sabbatical, don't panic, but while we were on sabbatical, we did actually visit many churches and cathedrals, particularly when we were in Tuscany, and we saw extraordinary works of art and sculptures and architecture. And we were in places that have been prayed in and worshipped in, and where we sensed in a variety of ways the real presence of God. There was one little church in a place that Dick recommended to us, San Gimignano, in the province of Siena. It sounds marvellous already, doesn't it? In fact, I'm off. But I came across this little statue of St. Jude. I mean, there were statues of St. Francis of Assisi everywhere. You couldn't move for St. Francis of Assisi. So I found the one of St. Jude. And in Catholicism, St. Jude is the patron saint of hopeless causes, which is probably why I'm so fond of St. Jude. And Mark chapter 5, you may not know this, not a lot of people know this. The St. Jude chapter of Mark chapter 5 is called the St. Jude chapter in the Bible. Because we had a hopeless case last weekend with a man who was demonically possessed. And today we see it again as Jesus demonstrates his power over death and disease in two stories in this passage. And this passage is also called, for those of you who sort of have studied the Bible and a bit of theology, you'll know this. It's called a Markan sandwich. I don't know what your sort of favourite sandwich is. Mine is cheese and pickle, definitely. But today, our favourite sandwich is a Markan sandwich. And there are about 9 Markan sandwiches in this gospel. And what it is where Mark begins a story, and halfway through the story interjects with another story before returning to the original story again. So you've got a sort of a sandwich here. And he does this to teach us something about God, a theological truth that sort of flows through these stories. And we're going to pick it up in verse 21 of chapter 5. So it's going to appear on the screens. And if you've got your Bible, you can underline the bits you want to. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she'll be healed and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd pressed around him. I'm going to stop there. This is a traumatic situation. Jairus in this moment is desperate. You know, Jesus and the disciples, they've returned from Decapolis. You know, they show up in Capernaum. They've got this large crowd that have gathered around. And Jairus comes and he throws himself at the feet of Jesus because his daughter is dying. And she doesn't have much longer. He's desperate here. And this is a really big, we just read this and don't really think about it. This is a really big deal because Jairus is a synagogue leader. He's a leader in the city. He's a religious leader. You know, and one of the reasons that it's a big deal is the religious establishment have had enough of Jesus. He's only just got going and they're already trying to turn on him, okay? And they're trying to sort of figure out the Sadducees, the Pharisees, how to do away with Jesus. So Jairus is risking everything in this moment. And so he comes to Jesus and he knows that it's going to cost him. It's going to cost him his reputation. It's going to cost him his pride, his status, his career. Guess what? It's amazing what you do for a child when you really love them. He doesn't care. It is actually, I've been thinking about this, it is the equivalent of a modern day imam turning to Christ. You know, he's leaving his religious system and he's putting his faith in Jesus here. And by bowing at Jesus' feet, he's basically declaring, Jesus, you are worthy. You are the only one that I know that can help me in this situation at this moment. So he has everything to lose, but he doesn't care because he's desperate in this moment. He needs a miracle. Do you know storms have a way of revealing our foundations? I was reading about a church that was hit by a tornado back in 2020 in the States. They were already in the middle of a reconstruction project. And this tornado came and it caused more destruction. And the engineers who were working on this particular project, while they were working on things, they realized there was a small area of the building which had been originally constructed by these particular builders. And they realized that when the storm came and it revealed the foundations, that they had not got the foundations right. And they said, to make this good, we've got to dig it out. We've got to rebuild. We've got to start all over again. What the leadership team of that church didn't say was, that's okay, don't bother about it, just build anyway. Even though it was going to cost them a lot more money, even though the insurance was not going to cover the extra cost that was involved in rebuilding, and they were going to be out of pocket, and that the delay set them back even further, they knew they needed to get the foundations right on that project. Because it doesn't matter what you build, if you don't get the foundations right, you're in trouble. And one of the main reasons they wanted to get this right was that particular block where the foundations had been uncovered and they weren't right was the children's block, where the children were. And they knew that it would affect the next generation. So they wanted to get the foundations right. I just want to say this as I read that the other day. Your foundations don't just affect you. They affect the next generation. That our foundations affect those who come behind us. And one of the biggest lies of the enemy is that what we do only affects us. Our legacy is how it affects those who come behind. So parents and grandparents, of whom there are many, godparents, okay. The greatest gift, honestly, the greatest gift that we can give to our children, our grandchildren, our godchildren, is the boldness and the courage to say, I am building my life on Jesus. I'm building my life on Jesus. You know, because the decisions we make about foundations affect ultimately the generations to come. So I want you to imagine Jairus in this moment. Okay, Jesus says, I'll go with you. And Jairus is going, this is it. This is it. And you know, his daughter's about to experience something miraculous because he's heard what Jesus can do. He's about to experience healing. This is incredible. He's excited that Jesus is coming. He starts walking with Jesus. They head off. The crowd is pressing in. They can hardly move at this moment. Then in verse 25 it says this. And a woman who was there, who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors. She'd spent all that she had, and instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his cloak because she thought, if I can just touch his clothes, touch the hem, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from the suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see people crowding against you, the disciples answered, and you asked, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. So they're making their way through the crowd. People are pressing. Who touched me? It's incredible. I mean, if I was one of the disciples, you cannot be serious. Everyone's touching you. Everyone's pressing in on you. But Jesus knew in that moment that somebody had got what they came for. They'd really come for it. And Mark tells us a little bit about this story that's really helpful. That this woman has been suffering from an issue of bleeding for a very long time. It's been constant. It's been going for 12 years. Interestingly enough, Jairus' daughter was how old? 12 years old. So the entire time that Jairus' daughter has been alive, this woman has been dealing with this issue of blood. And in that culture of that time, according to the law, that would have excluded her, it would have isolated her. She wouldn't have been allowed to be part of temple worship. She would have suffered separation from her family. She wouldn't have been able to touch other people. She was considered unclean by the religious system. And she is exhausted. Some of you might understand this. She's exhausted relationally, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and financially. She spent everything that she had. And she's desperate. And she's thinking, if I could just touch the hem of his garments. Maybe she had in the back of her mind a prophetic word from the Old Testament in Malachi that said, when the Son of Righteousness comes, there will be healing in his wings. And his wings means the corners. There's a Hebrew word, kanaf, which literally means wing. In the corners of his prayer shawl, which was the custom then and still the custom today that people wear their prayer shawls. There were wings in the corners of these prayer shawls, and maybe there was this belief that if I could just get hold of the corner of his prayer shawl, there will be healing for me. So by faith, she presses through the crowd. She touches the hem of the garment. Jesus goes, who touched me? And then it says in verse 33, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Do you remember the guides? Promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She's communicating the whole truth here, okay? Why does Jesus, some of you might think that's not very pleasant of Jesus. Why does Jesus call her out? Why does Jesus ask her to identify herself? She's already got the healing. Why would he stop and say, stop everybody? Where's that woman? Where is that woman? I have been thinking about it, and why would Jesus take time to hear her whole story? He's already healed her body. The reason I think is he's going after her heart. He wants her heart here. Sometimes when somebody's had to deal with 12 years of trauma, the greatest thing that we can give them in a very fast-paced life is the gift, the dignity of hearing their story. So he stops. He listens to her. He invites her to tell her story. He notices her. He already knows her story. But he takes time to hear her story. He doesn't cut her off. Doesn't finish her sentence for her. Anyone else ever done that? So what we see is the tenderness of Jesus. We see the compassion of the Father here. And he takes as long as she needs. I imagine Jairus at this moment, if I'm being honest. Listen, Jesus, we've got to be somewhere. What are you playing at? We've got to be somewhere. But it's like Jesus stops and says, no, Jairus, she's worth it. She is worth it. And Jesus says to her, I find this amazing in verse 34, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Do you know the only time in Scripture that Jesus calls somebody daughter is here? It's almost as though Jesus is saying, Jairus, I know you've got a daughter, but I've got one too. I'm stopping for her. I'm going to listen to her story, okay? Because he's not just about healing her body. He's about healing her heart. He's about restoration. He's about restoring her to community, to belonging. This woman who feels isolated and rejected and lonely and is labeled unclean, Jesus gives her a new label. It's daughter. Daughter, you belong. I've got goosebumps. I'm so sorry. You belong to me. You belong to me. Guess what? That is an identity that she can build her life on. And he says, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And he restores her to community. So we've got one story that Mark began, but another story that he tells in the middle. And then we come back to the original story again in verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? The servants are now concerned for Jesus. They're basically saying, we don't want to spend any more time on this. This is a hopeless case. Really, it's not worth it anymore. And verse 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus told Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. Jesus overhears these soul-smashing, hope-defeating words that they're saying. And he ignores them. He disregards them. He looks at Jairus and he says, don't give your heart to their words. Listen to mine. Don't be afraid. Just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. I want you to see this. This is really important. Jesus controlled what was going on here, in that he left the crowd outside and he took in with him Peter, James, and John, and the parents with him. He took his inner circle. He took his 3 a.m. friends. You know who your 3 a.m. friends are? They're the people you phone in the middle of the night if you're in a crisis, and you know, if they've got the phone by the bed, that they'll answer it. That these are the people that Jesus took with him into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. These are the ones he took up onto the Mount of Transfiguration that we've just actually remembered this past week. Here he takes them into the room. Why? Because he is discipling them. He's showing them. Interestingly, in the book of Acts, we might go there after Mark, but Peter also raises somebody from the dead, okay? How does he do it? He does exactly the same thing that Jesus did, which is actually what we're called to do. So Jesus is showing them what God the Father has the power to do. And so he brings them with him. But Jesus controlled the situation. He controlled who he was listening to. Now, in Jewish burial law, it was required to have mourners, professional mourners. There is a trained group of mourners here, okay? They're going, what are you on about? It's our job to mourn someone who's dead, you know. But Jesus uses this metaphor. She's not really dead. She's asleep. They laugh at Jesus. They mock him. But Jesus controls the environment of the room. And here's what I want us to see, actually. We have to control the voices that we listen to. We have to control the voices that we let into our hearts, the voices that we're engaging with. So Jesus, what is he doing? He's setting up this environment of faith. And he invites those who have the most faith to come into the room with him. His inner circle. He puts the other voices out. And then it says this, verse 40, and after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him. They went in where the child was. Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl stood, began to walk around. She was 12 years old, and at this they were completely astonished. And he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. And he told them to give her something to eat. So he raises this little girl from the dead. I love this. And he says, she's hungry. Get her some food. Get her some salt and vinegar crisps. That was the first thing I could think of. Get her pizza. Get her something. Just get her a Mark and sandwich. No, get her a cheese and pickle sandwich. And he's like, but don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And the people that are there are going, yeah, right. Yeah, right. She's got to go to school tomorrow. They'll all know. The mourners are already there. They're saying, well, everyone knows she's dead. We all know that she's dead. And I think what Jesus is saying here, interestingly, is don't tell people how this happened. Because he's controlling the timeline here. He knows that the religious system wants him dead. And he knows there's still quite a lot of work to do before he goes to the cross. So he's like, there will come a time when Mark, you can write your gospel and you can tell everybody, okay? But for now, don't say how this happened. So why does Mark give us these two stories? And what do they teach us about God? What do they teach us about the tenderness of God and the theology, theological response to human suffering? Very, very briefly. First is this, that God does not show favoritism. Paul in Romans 2 says, God is a respecter of no persons. And here's what we see in this account, is that these two people could not be more different, actually. Jairus was wealthy, and this woman spent everything she had on trying to find healing. She's poor. She's broke, you know. Jairus was religious. This woman has been excluded from the temple. Jairus was known for his morality. This woman is known as being unclean. Jairus was famous. This woman is anonymous. You don't know her name. Jairus was married with a family. This woman lived in isolation. He's a man. She's a woman. And, you know, we need to understand that God does not show partiality in the way that the world does. The world will step over a homeless person to get to a famous person. That is not Jesus. And Jesus says, whatever you do unto the least of these, you do it unto me. We need to understand that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. God does not show favoritism. Secondly, shows that we can trust God's timing. I have to be honest and say this is a frustrating truth in this passage. You've got the woman who's been waiting 12 years, and you've got Jairus who's been waiting 12 minutes, basically. There's a lot of waiting going on in this story. But I want to say this, because I believe this, that even in the waiting we can trust that God knows what he's doing. I've heard it said, and I love this phrase, that when you can't see the hand of God, you can trust the heart of God. When you can't see the hand of God, you can trust the heart of God. But sometimes I put my hands up and say that it is hardest when we can't see his watch, when we don't know his calendar, when we don't know God's timing. But what this passage teaches is that ultimately we can trust God's timing. And I need to say this. Healing can take time. Sometimes healing, because I've seen it happen too many times, can happen in a moment. Sometimes it can take place over 32 surgeries. And sometimes it won't happen until we're with him in heaven. But we can trust that God is always working. That we can trust his hand, that we can trust his heart, that we can trust his watch. And let me just say this. Waiting on the Lord is the hard work of faith. I really believe that. But I also know, because I've been there myself, that that is where God does some of his finest work. Thirdly, it shows us, I think, that God draws near to desperate faith. Desperation is the language of the kingdom. Desperation is saying, you'll only know this if you've been there. I don't have anybody else. See, God, I'm turning to you. I remember years ago when I used to go into prison, not to stay, but to visit people. Although maybe you think I should have, but it's... there was one guy who gave his life to the Lord. It was an amazing thing, but he said this to me, and I jotted it down. Sometimes you don't know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Sometimes you don't know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. That is desperate faith. What we see here in this moment of desperation with this woman is that Jesus stops and he notices her. And one of the lies of the evil one, you can't turn to God now. You didn't turn to him when everything was good. Do you think he's going to be interested in you now? It's a lie of the enemy. That is not the heart of the Father. The heart of the Father, Jesus tells this amazing story in Luke 15, which we've all know, we've reflected on, it's the Father sort of represents God. It tells the story of a father who's waiting for his wayward, errant son who's gone off in the wrong direction. He's waiting to return, and when he starts returning, the Father races towards him. Jesus doesn't put us on a guilt trip and says, you can't come to me because of what you did, or that, this, that, or the other. He doesn't do that. He stops, he listens, and he hears our story. Maybe, just maybe you're feeling desperate today. Maybe you've hit rock bottom. Maybe you are in a place of despair. Maybe you're struggling. Maybe you've done something. Or maybe something has been done unto you. You need to know the tenderness of Jesus, or the compassion of God. Sometimes God heals us in a moment. Sometimes over time. But very often, I've noticed, God likes to involve other people in what is an act of faith. That God heals with and through others, through a team of people. I have really discovered this, that I can get into trouble by myself. But it usually takes a team to get healed up. It can take other people. It can take a life group. It can take friends. It can take family. It can take a church, community. It can take doctors, nurses, therapists, counselors. It takes other people. God works through other people so that he gets the glory. It's actually why we minister down here at the front of church. Because I don't think for one moment that we can do life on our own. And I don't think for one moment there aren't those of us here who need the grace of God to touch our lives again. That's why we pray. It's why in a moment I'm going to invite you for prayer if you want prayer. But just as an aside, and I have actually finished, but I just want to answer one final question, because I was prompted with a question that I think is really important, maybe for one person here. Somebody in a real moment of vulnerability asked me, I wonder if God is punishing me for something that I did earlier in life. I wonder if you've ever thought that. I want to address that, because I do think many of us have asked that question at times, and I want to address it from Scripture, where Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, he says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now here's what that means. That's why we can celebrate what's happened to those young people at DTI. The moment we put our trust in Jesus, our guilt, our shame, our wrongs, our sin, they're all placed on Jesus. It's all been dealt with. Because Jesus took our punishment, it means that we are unpunishable. You are unpunishable. Because we have received the righteousness of Christ, the perfect life that we could not live on our own. We've received the holiness of Jesus. It's been credited. His holiness has been credited to our account. So that now when God looks at us, he doesn't see our sin. He doesn't see our shame. He doesn't see our wrongdoing, our failure. He sees a son. Or he sees a daughter. A son that he loves. A daughter that he loves. And that is a miracle. Amen?